Hi there, thanks for watching Revise the Right Way. Today we're going to be focusing on the IBDP English A, both SL and HL, Paper 2 preparation. And in particular, we're going to be looking at a question focusing on the role of dreams and what's the role of dreams in two of the texts that you have studied. Now you'll be able to see here that we're going to go through a variety of different steps, and as we talk through these, I'm going to ask you to do this with your own texts and to think about this in relation to any of the practice questions that you might be looking at. So the first thing here is to identify the key words in the question. So when we look at this question, what's the role of dreams? There are really two key words here, role and dreams. Obviously, when we think about role, we can think of it being kind of like a job or a function. It's something that kind of has maybe a transactional nature or has some kind of cause and effect. And as well as that, I want you to think about the part of the question which relates to dreams, and I've suggested that it's possible to look at dreams in all of these different ways. So we can look at dreams as both as literal dreams, like something that you kind of want to happen, like there's something where maybe you want to get a dream job or you want to have a dream holiday, something like that. And in some of the texts that we've looked at or that you will look at, you have these characters who have very literal dreams, very tangible, something that they can or want to achieve. At the same time, we can have metaphorical dreams, which are kind of a dream representing something else, and perhaps ideological dreams, which is maybe more the kind of thing that you might encounter with like oppressed or marginalized groups. They have this dream of something better. So it might be a dream of kind of like a better existence, but at the same time, it might also be about being perceived in a better or different way. As well as that, I think it's really important when we think about dreams that we're aware, or I guess with any of the keywords, that there's always different interpretations, and I don't want you to feel afraid to explore those different interpretations. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But I also want to think about how dreams are arguably adjacent to nightmares. They're kind of similar or in the same realm, and in a lot of texts we find dreams of the characters or of society becomes something that becomes unpleasant or doesn't have the kind of outcome that they're wanting. And as well as that, when we think about dreams, they're inherently fictitious. So I think looking at the constructed nature of this, particularly when we look at people's constructed identities or the kind of obfuscation of identity, this could be a really cool or interesting way of exploring this. Now, as I mentioned, there's always different ways to kind of explore the concept or idea of a dream. So when we think about it, if we look at the keyword dream, well, I think here there's a tendency to focus on like how this might be a positive or a kind of like an aspiration of the characters. But I think there's also different ways that we can kind of see dreams as a real emphasis on kind of systemic change, perhaps. So it could be how that's being achieved through perhaps the structure, the language, and the kind of symbolic nature of a text as well, perhaps. Okay, so here I think dreams is kind of one where it probably has like a very clear message or interpretation in your head, but I want you to think about here, could I possibly view the idea of dreams differently, and does that depend on the text that we're looking at, particularly when we look at kind of more Western-centric or Americanized texts, that emphasis on the American dream and the kind of disillusion or degradation of that at times is something that could be really interesting to kind of subvert or flip those expectations of the question. Okay, so once you've done that, and I hope that you're thinking about this in terms of the text that you're looking at, we're going to move over here and we're going to look at creating like a Venn diagram. Now, obviously, it's going to look a little bit nicer than this, and you can do it in a different format, and you've got graphic organizers or planners that will do this really well. But one of the things here, we've defined the scope of the question, and then we're thinking about how the key theme is shown in your text. So I would suggest over here, and you can do this visually or you can do this just by writing, whatever works for you, you establish what do we see in each text that's individually different when we think about dreams and collectively similar. So that's the whole point of comparing and contrasting in your paper 2 response, that we're trying to think of like, well, hey, look, that we have a similar text type but a different time period, or we have a similar or different narrative perspective that we'll talk a little bit more about here, and that might be really interesting or useful to explore and to kind of discuss in more detail. This is something that you may wish to do at the very start of your response, taking about 2 or 3 minutes, just to kind of jot down your initial ideas. And this can be both thematic as well as tapping into like specific characters and scenes, but being careful not to over describe. You have to emphasize how and why the scenes or ideas that you're looking at have an impact on us as a reader. And I think if we kind of expand on that further down here, one of the things that I'm asking you to do is to identify 2 or 3 key scenes for each text and to think about why they're important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about quotes, potentially linked to that, but you don't have to use quotes. And again, I'll mention that more. It is important, however, to think about how and why the scenes that you've chosen speak to the question, and how and why those those scenes have or are relevant in the context of the entire text. So being able to position it saying, hey, look, this is very early on and it impacts later events in this way, or it does the opposite, it's at the end, and we see the kind of build up to this foreshadowed earlier in the text. So just understanding how it's placed, but again, not describing that, just thinking about how and why the kind of narrative is structured in a certain way and what the narrator is trying to do in that process. Okay, so we're kind of identifying the scenes, and I've suggested here quotes or scenes. So down here, we're going to talk about both quotes and then some questions about like characterization, about setting, about conventions of text types, authorial intentions, and then narrative voice as well. So one of the things that I want you to think about, I think particularly with this question, we're looking at like the perspective here of like how we might perceive dreams and how the narrator / author sees dreams. So the kind of contrast or contradiction here between authorial intention, reader response, but also the narrative voice is really important here. And I've asked these questions, or I've asked you to think about these questions. What does the narrative voice tell us? Is there a bias? Are they reliable? Are they omniscient, like they know everything that's going on? Or are they the opposite of that? That's helpful. And it's also really useful for us to kind of contextualize how and why that is the case. Additionally, the question below that is asking you to think about the conventions or rules of each text. Well, first of all, you want to be thinking, how is this similar or different to the other text that I'm looking at? But how is it similar or different to other texts of the same type? So is it similar or different to the same kind of poetry that you've read, or the plays that you've read, or what does it do similarly and what does it do differently? Because those are the things that are going to be able to talk about, hey, look, there's a way in which it's either reinforcing or subverting the conventions, and that's interesting. Additionally, some stuff here, but you do need to be careful about overwriting here or focusing too much on context, but thinking about when the text was written, where it was written, whether it was originally written in a different language to the language that you're writing in. Think about what the significance of this might be. We have to be careful about presentism, viewing things through a modern lens, but at the same time, that's an inherent part of the process, right? So trying to think about when it was written, where it was written, that might help us to kind of explore, hey, this has a more Eurocentric or Western-centric, there's a more capitalistic mentality, or it's focused on like filial piety, and in the process, perhaps making some comments about how and why the time period could be relevant, but again, just be careful about that. So the other part to this is the focus on quotes, and there's a question here about how we might use quotes, whether we should even use quotes. And my feeling with this, and I think it kind of is reinforced by most, or a lot of teachers, I don't want to say most because that's unfair, I think it's one of those things where it is not a requirement at all to use quotes, but it's going to be a really easy and quick way to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the rest of the text, or how this works in relation to maybe the anthology, if it's a poetry anthology, or maybe something that you can kind of connect a scene to another scene through that kind of allusion. And I've suggested here the length of the quotes should be pretty short. I've said 2 or 3 words, and that might be too short at times, but it's really easy to remember. And I'm thinking about in The Road, we've got carrying the fire. In Gatsby, we've got the green light, or the beautiful fool that Daisy wants her daughter to grow up to be. It's super easy to remember these quick quotes. And I think it demonstrates, or like I said here, is shorthand proof that you know these texts. Additionally, it allows you to allude to other parts of the text. Maybe I don't want to talk about the entire text, or I don't want to emphasize it too much, but I really do want you to think about how is this text or is this part of the text connected to other parts, and that's a really easy way that I can do that. And then my final point on this is to embed your quotes. And what that really means is to make your quotes flow within a sentence. And there's a tendency sometimes to say, this is shown in the quote, and it's very labored, it sounds lethargic, it sounds kind of like limited or restrictive. So what I've given here as an example, Mrs. Lazarus conveys the systemic frustration felt by women as she acknowledges that she isn't the first or the last to be impacted by male hubris. Ironically, using the word "the" helps emphasize the significance of her husband's perceived ineptitude. Now, obviously, I could say more about that, and there is a typo in acknowledges. I will change that in a moment. But the point of this is that you can see that the quote is just placed within the sentence, within the point that I'm trying to make. And I think that makes it a bit more effective. It also means that you can then use other quotes to kind of reinforce the first quote. That's a really cool way of using that. Okay, I've now corrected the typo. I couldn't cope with that being like that without moving on. Okay, so the final thing here, and remember that we're not looking at everything here. We're not looking necessarily at every part of the structure, but we are looking at how we're going to bring this together to kind of unpack and explore a question in relation to 2 of the texts that you've looked at. So my suggestion or my request here for you is to use your notes, use your planning documents, and write a response to the question that you've been given. And I'll go back to the question at the very end. But my suggestion here, and it's kind of based upon in thinking, would suggest around this time frame, and just generally giving yourself time to plan. And it's really important that you take that time to plan, because A, it helps you to organize your thoughts. B, it means you don't repeat yourself. C, it means there's kind of a cohesion to your arguments and a development of your arguments. But also D, if you run out of time, the examiner can see where you were going with your point, and they're not necessarily going to reward you for that. And I think that's an important point to make. But I think for them, having the clarity to see, okay, I can see where you were going. Obviously, we want you to finish as much as possible, but that you had some kind of a development or a kind of line of argument that maybe there were some additional points that you kind of were going to make. So there it says, like it says, 15 minutes to plan, 90 minutes, an hour and a half to write your response, and then checking your response carefully once you've finished, giving you. So obviously you're going to have to carve 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes at the end to just kind of check, have you made any mistakes? Have you missed anything out? Did you not use that quote that you wanted to put in? And as a final point, if you're going to use quotes, my recommendation is as soon as the reading time finishes, you just write those quotes down. It doesn't matter if you're putting them into the order of your plan yet, but it just means that you're unloading it from your brain, so you don't have to worry about it at that point. So that's the first video I've done in quite some time, so I hope that was helpful. What we're looking at here is the role of dreams. We're going to be doing an assessment on this, and if you're just following along with us, I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. I hope this helps, and just think carefully about those steps, but also make sure that in your response you are carefully comparing and contrasting. Again, as always, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this, and good luck.